What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Surviving him. Part 1. Sarah's fingers trembled as she applied concealer to the bruise beneath her right eye. The morning news droned in the background, something about a mysterious illness spreading through major cities. She barely registered it anymore, too focused on making herself presentable before Marcus got home from his night shift. The concealer wasn't quite covering it this time. She leaned closer to the bathroom mirror, wincing as her fingers pressed against tender flesh. Last night had been bad. All because dinner wasn't hot enough when he wanted it. A scream from outside made her jump, smearing concealer across her cheek. She froze, listening. The peaceful suburban morning had turned strange. Car horns blaring in the distance. More screams, and what sounded like breaking glass. Sarah moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek out. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street was running. Actually running, which Sarah had never seen the elderly woman do before. Behind her, Mr. Peterson from 2 doors down was shambling in pursuit, but something was wrong with the way he moved. His normally pristine business suit was covered in dark stains, and his movements were jerky, unnatural. As Sarah watched, Mrs. Rodriguez stumbled on the sidewalk. Mr. Peterson fell upon her, and the sounds that followed made Sarah clamp her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Stay inside. Lock the doors. I'm coming home." Sarah's heart pounded as she read those words. On any other day, they would have filled her with dread. But as she watched Mr. Peterson rise from Mrs. Rodriguez's now motionless form, his face smeared with red, she realized she was caught between 2 kinds of monsters, and at least she knew what to expect from Marcus. The sound of breaking glass came from downstairs. Sarah spun away from the window, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she stood paralyzed, torn between the instinct to investigate and years of conditioning to stay exactly where Marcus told her to be. Another crash, closer this time, followed by the distinct sound of shuffling footsteps. Sarah's gaze fell on the packed overnight bag hidden in the back of her closet, the one she'd been slowly filling over the past month, waiting for the right moment to escape. Maybe this chaos was exactly what she'd been waiting for. If she was going to run, it had to be now, before Marcus made it home. But first, she had to deal with whatever was making those sounds downstairs. Part 2. Sarah crept down the stairs, her bare feet silent against the carpet. The baseball bat she'd hidden behind the dresser months ago, her secret insurance policy against Marcus's worst nights, was clutched tightly in her hands. She knew how to be quiet. Years of trying not to provoke her husband had taught her that much. The shuffling sounds were coming from the kitchen. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she could smell copper and rot, an overwhelming stench that made her gag. She pressed herself against the wall, inching toward the kitchen doorway. Her phone vibrated again in her pocket. Another text from Marcus. "Traffic's bad. People are crazy. Be there in 20 minutes." She switched the phone to silent, knowing his texts would only get more frequent, more demanding. The kitchen window was shattered, glass scattered across the linoleum floor. Through the broken window, she could see more chaos erupting on her once quiet street. Cars were abandoned, doors left open. Someone was screaming for help in the distance. Movement caught her eye. A figure hunched over by the refrigerator. It had been their mailman, Steve, who'd always smiled and asked about her garden. Now his uniform was soaked in blood, his skin a sickly gray. He turned at the sound of her sharp intake of breath, and Sarah saw that half his face was missing, torn away to reveal glistening bone and muscle. Steve, or what used to be Steve, lurched toward her with frightening speed. Sarah's muscles remembered the countless times she'd dodged Marcus's drunken swings. She sidestepped, bringing the bat up in a swift arc just as Marcus had unknowingly taught her to do when she studied his movements, learning the mechanics of violence to better anticipate his attacks. The bat connected with Steve's temple. He stumbled but didn't fall. Didn't even seem to notice. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she realized normal rules didn't apply here. She swung again, harder this time, remembering how Marcus had described breaking a man's skull in a bar fight, one of his favorite stories to remind her what he was capable of. The bat struck home with a sickening crack, and Steve finally crumpled to the floor. Sarah stood there shaking, bat dripping, as a horrible realization washed over her. She knew how to do this. Years of surviving Marcus had prepared her for this moment. She knew how to read body language, how to anticipate attacks, how to be ruthless when necessary. Her phone buzzed again. 10 minutes away. "Answer me." Sarah looked at the shattered window, then at Steve's body. She couldn't stay. Marcus would be looking for someone to blame for this mess, and she knew from experience that he wouldn't care, that none of it was her fault. She ran upstairs, grabbed her emergency bag, and added a few last-minute items. The bat, her hidden cash stash, the bottle of Marcus's prescription sleeping pills she'd been secretly collecting, one pill at a time. She changed into running shoes and practical clothes, things Marcus hated her wearing because they made her look like a lesbian. As she headed for the back door, she heard a car engine roaring down the street. Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew the sound of that engine. Marcus was early. She had seconds to decide. Face him, or take her chances with the zombies. Part 3. The decision made itself when Sarah heard Marcus's car door slam. She bolted through the back door, not bothering to close it behind her. The less time he spent wondering where she'd gone, the better. Their backyard backed up against the Hendersons' property, where a gap in the fence, one she'd carefully memorized during her planning, would let her slip through to the next street. She'd thought about this escape route so many times, but never imagined she'd be using it during what looked like the end of the world. As she squeezed through the fence gap, she heard Marcus's bellow of rage echo from the house. He must have found Steve's body, or maybe he'd seen the back door open. Either way, she knew that sound. It was the tone he used right before things got really bad. "Sarah! Get your ass back here!" She ran faster, her overnight bag thumping against her hip. The next street over was Maple Drive, and it was chaos. A car had crashed into a lamppost, its horn blaring endlessly. 2 zombies, she had to start calling them that now, were pounding against someone's front door while screams came from inside. Down the block, she could see more of them shambling around, drawn by the car horn. A gunshot cracked through the air behind her. Marcus had grabbed his pistol. She'd known he would. It was always his favorite thing to clean when he was angry, a not-so-subtle threat. "I can see you, you stupid bitch!" Another shot, this one closer, pinging off a mailbox near her head. She darted behind a parked SUV, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. But the gunshots had attracted attention. The zombies at the front door turned, and others began emerging from between houses, all drawn to the noise. Sarah stayed low, moving from car to car, letting the gathering horde put themselves between her and Marcus. More gunshots, but these were followed by Marcus cursing. She risked a glance back and saw him backing away from 3 zombies, firing frantically. He was a good shot. She knew that from the certificates on his wall and the threats he'd made. But these things didn't go down easily. Even his perfect headshots only seemed to stagger them. "This is your fault!" he screamed, his voice cracking with rage and fear. "When I find you—" His threat was cut off by his own scream. While he'd been focused on the zombies in front of him, another had grabbed him from behind. Sarah watched as Marcus, the man who had terrorized her for years, was dragged down by gray hands and snapping teeth. She should have felt something. Relief? Maybe, or justice. Instead, she felt numb as she turned away. Her body was on autopilot, moving quietly and efficiently, just as it did after Marcus's worst rages. She had a plan. She had supplies. She had years of practice at surviving, but a new sound made her freeze. Crying. Specifically, a child crying. It was coming from the house with the broken-in front door, where the zombies had been trying to get in. The same house where she'd seen the young Collins family move in just last month. Sarah looked down the street, where she could see a clear path to the main road. Then she looked back at the house. She knew what it was like to be trapped, to pray for someone, anyone, to help. She adjusted her grip on the baseball bat. She had a choice to make, and for the first time in years, Marcus wouldn't be the one making it for her. Part 4. Sarah moved toward the Collins house, keeping low and quiet. The crying was coming from upstairs, a child's high-pitched wail of terror that made her chest ache. She counted 4 zombies clawing at the front door, which was starting to splinter. She knew she couldn't take all 4 head-on. Marcus had taught her that much, unintentionally. Never fight fair, he'd told his drinking buddies once, bragging about bar brawls. Make them come to you, one at a time. The garage of the house next door was open. Inside, she spotted a rack of garden tools. Sarah crept over and found what she was looking for. A gas can. She'd filled her own just last week, one of Marcus's countless demands. She knew how heavy a full can should feel. This one was nearly full. The memory of Marcus making her siphon gas once, punishment for letting the tank get too low, rose in her mind. She pushed it away. Focus. Survive. She poured a trail of gas from the garage toward the zombies, her movements careful and controlled. The creatures didn't notice her. They were too focused on the door, on the sounds of life behind it. Just like Marcus had always been, too focused on her to notice she was changing, learning, planning. When the gas trail was laid, she pulled the emergency lighter from her bag. Another secret tool, hidden away for her escape. One flick, and flames raced along the ground toward the zombies. They noticed the fire too late. Their rotting clothes caught quickly, and their unnatural shrieks filled the air as they staggered away from the door, flailing. The sight and smell made Sarah's stomach turn, but she forced herself to watch. She needed to know they weren't getting back up. When she was sure the burning zombies were down, she ran to the front door. "Mrs. Collins?" she called, knocking rapidly. "It's Sarah, from down the street." "Help!" a woman's voice called back, thick with tears. "Please, they're inside. My husband, he got bitten. He's not himself." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Where are you?" "Upstairs bathroom." "I've got Tommy with me, but Jim's in the hallway. He's trying to break down the door." Sarah tested the front door. It was still locked. "I'm coming in through the kitchen window," she called up. "Stay put." The kitchen window was already broken, probably how the infected Jim had gotten in. Sarah cleared the remaining glass with her bat and climbed through, landing softly on the counter. The house was dark, but she knew how to move in darkness. Marcus had made sure of that. Shuffling sounds came from upstairs, followed by another bang against what must have been the bathroom door. Tommy's crying grew louder. Sarah took a deep breath and started up the stairs, bat ready. The Jim she knew had been a kind man who brought her tomatoes from his garden. But she'd learned long ago that men could change. Sometimes they turned into monsters. And she knew how to handle monsters. Part 5. The upstairs hallway was narrow, forcing a confrontation. Jim's infected form stood at the bathroom door, shoulders hunched, fingers bloody from clawing at the wood. He turned as Sarah reached the top step, and she saw his face. The kind eyes she remembered now milky white, jaw slack and stained red. Sarah's mind flashed to Marcus's face in those moments before violence. The way his features would twist, becoming something inhuman. This was different, she told herself. Jim wasn't in there anymore. This wasn't a man choosing to be a monster. This was just a monster. He charged her with surprising speed. Sarah sidestepped, a movement practiced countless times in her own hallway. But the space was too tight. Jim's shoulder caught her, slamming her into the wall. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, but she managed to keep hold of the bat. "Sarah?" Mrs. Collins called through the door. "Are you okay?" She couldn't answer, too focused on keeping Jim's snapping teeth away from her face. His strength was unnatural, like Marcus on his worst nights when blind rage seemed to make him superhuman. But Sarah had survived those nights. and she would survive this. She brought her knee up hard, not between the legs like she'd sometimes fantasized about doing to Marcus, but into Jim's stomach. It created just enough space for her to slip away, to get the bat between them. The first swing caught him in the shoulder, doing little damage. The second missed entirely as he lunged for her again. But the third connected with his temple, just like she'd hit Steve. The crack was louder this time, more final. Jim went down. Sarah hit him twice more, making sure he wouldn't get back up. Then she slumped against the wall, breathing hard. "It's done," she called to the bathroom door. "You can come out." The door opened slowly. Mrs. Collins stood there. Tommy clutched to her chest, both of them pale and tear-stained. They looked at Jim's body, then at Sarah, then at the baseball bat in her hands. "How did you—" Mrs. Collins trailed off, perhaps seeing something in Sarah's face that answered her unfinished question. "We need to go," Sarah said, straightening up. "It's not safe here." She looked at Tommy, managing a gentle smile. "Hey, buddy, want to go on an adventure?" The little boy nodded, still sniffling but looking at Sarah with something like awe. She remembered feeling that way about the school counselor who had once asked about her bruises, like maybe there were people in the world who could help after all. "I have supplies," Sarah continued, "and I know somewhere we might be safe." She did. A women's shelter 3 towns over, one she'd researched extensively during her escape planning. "We'll have to be careful, be quiet, and stick together. Can you do that?" They both nodded, and Sarah felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. For years, she'd believed Marcus when he said she was weak, useless, nothing without him. But here she was, alive while he wasn't. Here she was, saving others instead of just herself. "Stay close," she said, leading them toward the stairs. "I know how to handle the monsters." And she did. She'd been handling monsters for years. The ones outside might look different, might be easier to spot with their gray skin and rotting flesh, but they weren't any scarier than what she'd already survived. Sarah gripped her bat with steady hands and led her small group down the stairs. For the first time in years, she wasn't running away from something. She was running toward something. Freedom, purpose, and maybe even hope. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that story as much as I did. Come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember to face your fears.